Yo, yo, yo. Don't believe I'm on Facebook. Let's see. It is what it is. I'll make sure I post it up there for everybody to get a chance. Today, we're going to be talking Big Beautiful Bill. I'm going to make this as quick as possible, but I really did want to come in and talk about the bill. I know there's been a lot of different takes, a lot of different, this is beneficial for us, this is not beneficial for us, or what it actually is and what it does or does not do. And I'm gonna only really touch on the highlights of it because it's a very, very actually thick bill. I'm not going to, be honest with y'all, go into like the defense spending and all of that, but I do think that that is very, very consequential. And I think that's why a lot of people have critiques about it. But before I go ahead and get started, can everybody like the video, share the video, leave a comment, please? Thank you. I would appreciate it very, very much. Again, I'm here. I'm trying to have conversations that aren't necessarily as salacious as everybody else. Just level-headed conversations. You can agree, you can disagree. I'm not here to be the ruler of what is right or wrong. So go ahead and get started, man. Big beautiful bill, Donald Trump, everybody's up in arms about what it is going to do. So I'm gonna go ahead, take this first here. We have a diagram. Got this from, I did this from ChatGPT, and it took me a little bit because I actually, went back and forth to make sure everything was correct. But as you can see, I did a 10-year outlook because I wanted to kind of see how it impacts over time, because as I said before, policy and bills are to be judged in retrospect. A lot of things has to be reviewed once the ink dries and see how it kind of plays out and interacts with the whole environment overall. But I am going to go ahead and look at this from a just facial lens in terms of it being word for word, like what we're actually getting in the moment right now and how it just interacts on paper. So this is going to be the, again, 10-year outlook, HR 1 Senate, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, introduces sweeping fiscal changes, eliminating federal income tax on tip income, the cuts to American-made cars and expansion to the child tax credit. And then we are going to examine how each provision affects Americans in the 60% income range versus the higher income earners, the 10 to 20%, because I think that that is a very big difference in terms of how you're actually going to be internalizing this bill, because those who sit at the higher earner ranges are going to be a little bit more favorable for this bill. But I'll get into it a little bit later in terms of how kind of in that 10-year outlook that might also be problematic, because when you add in the social dynamics, it might have some different impacts. So the no tax on federal tips, again, that's kind of on the surface. Breaks allows the deduct tip income from federal tax income. In effect, tips are free from the federal income tax up to a cap. The Senate version has $25,000 in tips per year. This change is temporary, applying for 2025 to 2028. And the state's payroll taxes still apply. And service industry employees such as waitstaff, bartenders, hairstylists, etc., your gig economy jobs are going to be the primary beneficiaries for that. There are income phase out to target the relief, and the deduction begins phasing out for individuals at $150,000 per year and couples at a $300,000 income, which meaning most income filers won't qualify. And below, we assess the mid-income versus higher income groups. And so right here, you can see the income on the middle income Americans. It'll be little to none. As you see, this provision boosts take-home pay. The White House Council on Economic Advisors estimated that eligible tip workers will keep an extra $1,675 per year on average, which isn't necessarily that much when you actually sit around and do the math and net, because I think a lot of people are looking at these different subsidies or credits or whatever you want to call them. Credits is what they are. When you do the math on the cost of living and everything else that actually goes hand in hand with the bill, you get actually a net negative. Then it says right here, by increasing immediately available income, the untaxed tips provide meaningful stabilizing support for a large segment of hourly workers. This somewhat could alleviate labor wage imbalances by boosting net pay for service workers without requiring employees to raise wages. So again, this is an example of something being really good, but on average, if it's saying 2,000, let's even bump it up. $400, right? You have to also factor in from there everything and the costs associated with getting through that whole year. So that extra $2,000, even though you might have it, and yes, it is going to make your life slightly better, also layer on top of that the fact that you have a bill that also is upward in the trillions in terms of it increasing the deficit, so which has the capacity to inflate the dollar even more and raises the standard of living that much more, which is why Trump and all these MAGA and all these Republicans always have been screaming about the budget and about the deficit and about the spending, because that is an impact. I know a lot of people might not necessarily agree with that, but that is an impact. I'm not necessarily saying that it should keep people from doing certain policies, like the right kind of uses it to argue against, but keep that in mind, though. If you are getting that extra $2,000 bump, how is that $2,000 getting eaten up in other costs of living or inflation, et cetera, over time? You know what I'm saying? That's why I did a 10-year outlook. So it says, however, the reach of this tax break is limited. Only about 2.5% of workers, 2.5% of the workforce, roughly 4 million people, work in jobs with tips. Even within the service sector, not all low-wage workers get tips. For example, fast food cashier earning $9 an hour receives no tips and thus gains nothing from this bill. In fact, analysis shows over 1/3 of tip workers won't benefit because their incomes are so low, they owe no federal income tax to begin with. On the workers in the greatest need, thus see no change. As an economist, Ernie Tedeschi noted, a deduction for tip work is a pretty horrible way to help low-wage workers. It's not helping the lowest of low-wage workers because they do not have any federal tax liability. In other words, this measure assists a subset of middle-income earners, those on tip roles who earn enough to pay taxes, but fails to reach many impoverished workers outside of the tipping economy for those earning too little to owe tax. Critics argue that raising the minimum wage would do far more for low-income workers than a tip tax cut. Another limitation is the temporary nature. The tax break is only legislated through 2028. If it sunsets, any gains for workers vanish unless renewed, which adds uncertainty for households planning long term, which is basically, yeah, you're getting the tips, you're getting the extra income, but when that extra income stops, if you haven't transitioned into another mode of work, you potentially are going to have a shortfall, because typically most people, when they make more money, they increase their lifestyle and they bring on and take on more things. That's not, a lot of people I know say, well, people should downsize. But again, we live in a first world nation. I think it is behoove of everybody to start acting like it. And I think it is, a little bit intellectually dishonest to say that, again, for these low wage workers, we're talking about people who are at the threshold, the bare minimum, to actually take from the bare minimum. I know people had that conversation a lot, but I think it's very, very, very disingenuous when it comes to this is a first world nation. Like, this is not a third world or even a developing nation. So I don't think that people should have to be forced to live within the sub-minimum, sub-par standards. And again, I'm not saying that people shouldn't save. I'm not saying that people shouldn't downsize. That is a conversation, but there has to be a standard to which I believe in a first world nation that we can't drop below. That's just me. I may be wrong, but again, leave a comment. Tell me how dumb I am. Tell me if that makes sense. I don't know. Impact on higher earners, I'm going to just skip over that because for the most part, is no real benefit because they exceed the actual $150,000 to $300,000 brackets. So the big one is going to be next, these cuts to Medicaid and the Medicare, the rule changes in federal healthcare programs, notably Medicaid, health insurance for low-income people, and Medicare, which is health coverage for seniors and certain disabled individuals. These changes are aimed to make curbing costs, I lost tighter eligibility and reduced benefits in some areas. Key provisions include more frequent Medicaid eligibility redeterminations and verification requirements, the introduction of work requirements for some Medicaid enrollees, penalties for the states that don't enforce these rules, and restrictions on who can receive Medicare benefits. The bill also seeks to delay a rollback on certain planned expansions of services. It delays new minimum staffing regulations for nursing homes, and that's a rule intended to improve the care quality. On the other hand, the bill provides some increases in healthcare funding in target areas, such as higher payments to rural hospitals and expanded telehealth coverage in under Medicare, in an effort to bolster access to underserved areas. Overall, however, the trajectory is a reduction in entitlement spending growth. We analyze how these changes impact on different income groups. The 60% group, average Americans, are poised to feel significant impacts for the cuts, especially those in the lower half of the income distribution, for experiencing economic hardship. Let me see here. So for average, no, that's the child tax income credits. Threw me off. Yep, here we are. So again, I wanted to touch on this part because I know a lot of people have been talking about, well, people should actually be on a restricted regimens, which I'm not necessarily in complete disagreement with. So I'll say socially the net effect for the middle class skews negative. By strengthening eligibility requirements and reducing benefits, the policy risks greater inequality in health outcomes. Healthcare becomes less of a right and more of a dependent on continuous employment and flawless paperwork. This is precarious given the other stressors. If AI and automation cause job displacements, many displaced workers may need Medicaid during job transitions, precisely when work requirements would deny them coverage for being unemployed, which is a cruel catch-22. Similarly with higher consumer prices. And I wanted to kind of touch on that part because, again, specifically, it's not so much, and this is where this bill, I understand it on its face, right? I understand, and let me go here for a second. I understand on its face where people are talking about the fact that there should be stricter requirements. We should have the ability to go after people and create regimens that people have to follow that would create a for people to actually transition off of Medicaid. Sorry, I may be picking the wrong one. But what we are not factoring in, and why I think a lot of people who are on the other side are saying that this is going to be catastrophic, is because you are placing this in an ecosystem where we already have mass layoffs, where we have, again, this subsecting group of people who don't necessarily have credible job histories that would allow them to transition into the workforce. Especially when you have a workforce that is heavily still denying people with college degrees, with resumes, just because of the instability of the ecosystem right now. And so you have a situation where you're creating the stricter requirements at a moment in time where it doesn't necessarily match up. If you would have did this maybe a decade ahead, then it would have maybe a different outcome because we're talking about a better job market, we're talking about a better economy, et cetera, right? And so you have all of these different competing forces, which doesn't necessarily bode well for, again, let's say the person can't necessarily meet those requirements because the literacy rates are very low. And we're talking about even for people who are working. And so for a person who might have been on this as a legacy recipient being somebody who's been on there for generations, et cetera, they now find themselves in a place where they're in an ecosystem competing with college grads who also can't necessarily find jobs. So it's not necessarily the bill on its face is negative towards Black people or poor people in that way. It's about how it is disrupting an ecosystem without actually giving attention to the way that you're going about transitioning people into and off of these programs. Because again, I kind of sit in the middle. I understand the need for it, but I also understand that it can also create a bigger problem and a bigger issue if not done correctly. And I think that's where we're at with this situation, because when people get hungry and they don't necessarily have the skills, the assets, and the resources, they will begin to affect the people around them in a way in which, again, we've had defund the police. We've had all these other initiatives. We have cities battling with how they police, cities battling with how they go about doing all of these things. And I think it is just a combination of the issues where it's going to create the backslide for me. I don't necessarily think that on its face, but I also would tell people don't actually look at any bill on its face, because it all has to interact within an ecosystem that involves humans, that involves business transactions, that involves all different kinds of elements. And I think that's where a lot of people go wrong with trying to assess policy. So again, this is going to be the higher income earners. Again, the direct fakes minimal in the short term, but they're important indirect long-term considerations by virtue of their incomes. Top 10 to 20% households seldom qualify for Medicaid. They typically have private health insurance, offer employer-sponsored individual plans, and that means they pay for the care. So the new Medicaid barriers requirements do not personally affect wealthy individuals. They were never on Medicaid to begin with. In fact, this group might philosophically support these changes, viewing them as cost-saving measures for encouraging self-reliance. But again, I would disagree, because with people still going to go to the hospital and them bills are not going to be paid for, and we'll potentially, as the consumer, those of us who do pay for it, will have to eat those costs, higher costs. And again, we might not necessarily be making that much more. So that extra maybe $400, $500, $600 may knock you out, because it's like those disasters that were happening over in what's that neighborhood in California. Once those disasters happen, now the insurance skyrockets so high that you got people who can't necessarily afford it, because again, even though you were paying, and even though you aren't necessarily that bottom rung of society, now the insurance is so high because a lot of people couldn't pay the insurance claims and just kind of bellied up. Now we're in a situation, you know? So I think it is behoove of us to kind of think of, hold on, let me see. I didn't read this part. Indirectly, upper middle income individuals could feel the ripple effects of an eroded safety net in their communities and workforce. Here we go. For instance, if many workers lose Medicaid and face health crises, businesses, including the owned and managed by higher earners, might see increased absenteeism or lower charitable assistance and public programs shrink. There's also an economic argument. Medicaid and Medicare inject a lot of federal funds into the healthcare system. There's also an economic argument where Medicaid and Medicare hospitals may respond to charging, here we go, higher prices to private insurers to compensate for lost public funding. The cost can circulate back to higher income people through rising insurance premiums over a decade if tens of millions lose coverage. Boom, bow. Damn, I'm smart. Thank you, ChatGPT. You just reaffirmed me. Thus, finally, the top 10% are not immune to second order effects. They may end up paying for more health care or insurance because they can't pay at all. Bow, boom. So the tax deductions on interest next up for American-made cars. Another notable provision in the 2025 tax bill is tax deduction for new car loans, effectively eliminating federal tax on car loan interest for qualifying purchases. To qualify, the vehicle's final assembly must occur in the United States. In other words, it's an incentive to buy American-made cars. This deduction is also time limited, covering loans from 2025 through 2028. The law defines an applicable passenger vehicle and excludes certain cases like fleet vehicles or cars bought for resale or parts. This has to be a brand new vehicle, people. Brand new, brand spankety new off the lot. And again, some people might consider that a win, some people might consider that a W, but if you like average earner, maybe $70,000, $80,000 in the USA, do you really want to buy a brand new car? Do you really want to have to spend like 60, 70 bands on a car? Because again, the American made Cars are a little bit more, expensive, especially if you're getting the higher trims. But, that's to each his own. That's one of them things where I think that it sounds good, but in the end, again, high earners, not people making them big bucks, they're going to live. They can get it anyway. So I think that their whole mindset is like, I got it. It is what it is. Impact on middle income Americans. Family buys a new car for $30,000, putting in a 5-year loan, 67% interest. In the first year, they might pay roughly $1,600 of interest on the loan. Again, that's a deduction. Let's see. Impact on higher earners. Higher earners, again, 10 to 20% bracket earners generally will see limited direct benefit from the car loan interest deduction, as many of this group fall outside of target conditions. Again, first, the deduction phases out for incomes above roughly 150,000 single and 250K joint. A household in the top 10% often has income in its range or higher, for example, in the 80-90 percentile. Let's see. From a broader economic lens, higher earners might indirectly gain if this policy boosts the auto industry's performance. A strong auto sector can positively affect the stock market and dividends. There you go. Again, because they got the ability to invest in that way. I'm not mad at that. It's not quite me yet. If auto manufacturers benefit from increased domestic sales, shareholders, which again include plenty higher income earner individuals or funds they invest in. You can see that upside. I could see that. That makes sense. One possible downside for high earners is that, like any other tax expenditure, this deduction has a revenue cost. If the lost revenue isn't fully offset, it adds to the deficit, which is what I was talking about in the beginning. Indeed, the bill increases the debt limit by $5 trillion. Yes, $5 trillion. So they is still spending cash money. Don't be listening to these people about fiscal policy. Democrats and Republicans be seeing eye to eye, you see. They think the same when it comes to spending money because y'all like stuff and people want stuff and they gonna keep giving it to y'all to shut y'all up. So yeah. It is what it is. America gonna keep spending that bag. Let's see. Child tax credit, key policy. It prevents from shrinking in 2026 by making the 2027 law permanent. Prior to this bill, the child tax credit was set to revert from 2000. It will be bumped up, I want to say to 4, if I'm not tripping. Let me see if they got it. This bill did not make the credit fully refundable for those with no income tax liability. Amendment do so. Y'all can read along, get the video. I'm going to post the PDF, see if I can do that somewhere. The bill also tightens eligibility, requiring both the child and the claimant parent have social security numbers. Impact on middle income Americans. For average American families with children, child tax credit CTC expansion is generally a significant positive. The families stand to gain directly through lower tax bills or larger refunds each year, with the credit rising from $2,200 per child to an extra $200 per child annually compared to the current law, which is at $1,200. For a middle-class family with 2 children, see, that's some BS. That's some nonsense. That's what I'm talking about. Like, what? Again, people talking about, am I reading that right? $200? Yeah, what the fuck am I gonna do with $200, man? Fuck. Can't do nothing with that, man. Stop it. Buy some candy. You go out to dinner and eat. You go to McDonald's and that's almost gone. The hell? More impactful is the permanence and certainty this provides. Middle income families can now plan on the CTC, plan on it, stand at its elevated level. Without this bill, the credit would have halved after 2025. I mean, I guess it is what it is. That's how y'all want to approach it, but I'm not necessarily fan. Let me see. Interplay with economic stresses, rising layoffs and jobs insecurity. The safety net cuts comes at a perilous time for job security as layoffs accelerates. Many middle income Americans will rely on programs like Medicaid, SNAP, and expended CTC to stay afloat. That's kind of what I was mentioning and talk about earlier in terms of all of the moving pieces. The housing market vitality, the middle class has been squeezed by housing costs and high interest rates. The bill doesn't directly address housing. However, the extra income from the child tax credit or tip deductions can help families meet rent or mortgage payments. Boom, boom, bow. But again, like I said up at the top, when that goes, opposite effect. Because again, remember, this is a 10-year outlook. This is a 10-year outlook. persistent higher consumer prices, aka inflation. And again, it says the bills are mixed in an inflationary context for consumers, middle income, untaxed tips, deductible costs, and a bigger CTC all mean more disposable income to cover expensive groceries, gas, and utilities. Exactly. Getting your money ate up. Then it says AI and automation displacement. And that's not something that people are talking about a lot. With AI coming in, we got a whole nother market and a whole nother subgroup of people who might not necessarily have jobs based on how this is trending, who again are going to be more credible to find work than the person who is trying to be transitioned off of Medicare and Medicaid for whatever reason. How does Bill's Keys provision interact with it? For displaced middle income workers, a robust safety net and opportunities to reskill are crucial. HR 1 tightens the safety net and doesn't include major workforce training funding. Again, there's no funding for workforce training and transition pieces. So you're just moving people off, but there is no funnel to redirect. So you just end up with a bunch of people who are crashing and want to be crashing out. Average middle income, this group sees a more mixed outcome. On one hand, tax cuts put money in their pockets. Parents get more child credits. Workers keep tax income. Prospective car buyers get a break. These help them cope with cost of living pressures and can stimulate economic activities. Over 10 years, that can mean higher cumulative income for many families, potentially improving standards of living or at least preventing backsliding. On the other hand, cuts to Medicaid, SNAP, and other support removing important backstop. And for those who are maybe asking, I'm doing more the middle average because my audience is more middle average. If you a higher earner, don't feel insulted. Y'all got the bag, man. It is what it is. I know y'all can go out here. Let me hold $5. Throw a little something up there. Man, my cash app is the Black Anglo-Saxon. THEE, for all my high earners, you 10 to 20% earners who got that bag, who gonna be paying for the actual healthcare and not be getting the benefits on the back end. Let me see. So yeah, this is just some charts down here at the bottom, I just wanted to go ahead and be thorough in that. But again, like I said, I'll try to find it and put that up somewhere. But that is the big, beautiful bill, people. At least the parts of, again, like I said, I'm not going to really get into the defense spending and money to this nation. And I ain't going to call out a nation because I don't know. I might get pinged if I call out the nation that they sent the money to, you know what I'm saying? But they out here whacking people off. We know who they are. I don't know if we can still name them on these internet spaces. So I'm not going to do it because right now I'm in a space where I want my little channel to grow. But we know how these people be carrying it. But again, we got the ICE additions to the funds, a lot of different things. So I really just wanted to kind of touch on that before I get into the conversation